Where the hell am I? Hey everybody, welcome back to the Irish Poetic channel. This is First Impressions, that's right. It's the show where we review albums once per week per your request. I'm your host Gavin, per the usual, and as you can see, I'm back at college. This is not my normal backdrop, but yeah, I'm back at college for my second year. I'm still figuring out lighting in this new room, but bear with me as I experiment in the coming weeks. Today, a very special review as we've got Sabrina Carpenter, and we are reviewing her new album, Short and Sweet. Let's see what we have today. First, you're probably wondering, where's the Sprite that I drink every episode? Well, I kind of already drank it today. While I was making this script, I kind of drank it on accident. But next week, full Sprite cans, I promise. But yes, Sabrina Carpenter, her very, very, very anticipated album, probably the biggest album of August, if not the summer. The sensation herself, the singer, the superstar, the 4'11" pop queen herself, Sabrina Carpenter, has released her new studio album, Short and Sweet, which is an apt description of her and also of this album as it sits at a very short 36 minutes long. But as far as what I think about Sabrina and her work in the past, I've never really been super intrigued by her previous works, being that it never really stood out to me as anything more than just standard pop albums. She's seen decent success and obviously has been a name that's been around for a couple years, being that she got her start on, I believe, Girl Meets World back in the mid-2010s as a Disney Channel actress, as she is the latest addition to a long list of actors from Disney Channel who have become singers in the pop genre as they evolve their careers. But she comes across as a pop star in the same vein as Olivia Rodrigo, as Selena Gomez, the Jonas Brothers, and if you look back far enough, similar to Justin Timberlake, Christina Aguilera, that sort of artist. And so she is the most recent example of a pop superstar who got their start on Disney Channel. And while none of her past works have particularly impressed me, her most recent being the 2022 long play, Emails I Can't Send, which saw moderate success, but she has never really quite seen anything as mainstream as this album, which has been leaded by the two singles, Espresso and Please Please Me, which I will talk on a bit later. But this is the first Sabrina work which I have really actually been interested in seeing, as she has really entered the mainstream here, achieved superstardom, and become a real heavyweight in the pop field. And as these lead singles, as I've talked about and will talk about, have showed a lot of promise to the world, I was intrigued to see what she could do. As with her recent works earlier this summer, you kind of see that she has really got a knack for creating earworms and pop hits with interesting and sassy vocal lines and delivery. And she's also done a really good job on those singles at creating that sort of summer vibe, that sort of shimmering, nostalgia-filled, bright colors, bright sunlight type feel, as you can clearly see on this album cover. She's also come up with quite the music video, with Espresso being a very popular watch this summer. However, coming into this, I was very wary of the typical pop star routine of putting out 2 or 3 really, really good singles and then having the rest of the album feeling quite rushed. So that was a very apparent danger I was going to take heed of going into this album, and I did examine going into it, but did she fall into this category of an album with great singles but not much deep cuts? Well, let's see as we get into it. As we start off with the song Taste, which was not a single, but this track was pretty decent. I gave it a 7 out of 10. It's just a pretty good pop song, albeit a little bit basic, but it has a decent melody, and it has a nice instrumental hook, and all things do come together pretty nicely in the production overall. It's not a song that is particularly masterful per se, but it is a solid song, and that's why I gave it that decent 7 grade. But moving on, that takes us into our first single on this album, Please Please Please, which came out a couple months ago, maybe 1 or 2 months ago. And has been all over the internet ever since, as it has taken off as one of the anthems of this summer. And rightfully so, as I really enjoyed this song and gave it a 9. As you'd just kind of be hard-strapped to find a mainstream pop song as popular as this right now, and it's for good reason, as you have those really nice hooks, those really nice lead parts, those really nice vocals, and lyrics that are interesting as they explore this really relatable and common subject of breakups, which nearly everyone can relate to, but in a way that's not very cliche and just another breakup song. As Sabrina is able to deliver this really interesting perspective on a breakup, of not being so upset that the relationship is over, the love is over per se, but really lean more into how will this affect other people's perceptions of me. which is a very interesting interpretation that we don't really see much of as far as that side of emotion covered. But overall, the mix is nice on this song. I like the instrumentals, the funky bass line. Being a bassist myself, of course, I appreciate that. But this song just really pops and has a very colorful approach. The music video matches this, which really can, honestly, emphasize the song content through video. And I quite enjoyed this track, and it deserves its well-appreciated status in pop music right now. This leads us into Good Graces, which isn't necessarily my favorite track. The third song on this album really only captures a 5 out of 10 for me, as it switches things up into more of an R&B feel, which I kind of appreciate, but it does not lean fully into that R&B feel. It just kind of has aspects, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly fine to vary up in just minimal aspects on a song. However, it's not done super well, just because I feel like the mainstream pop sort of vibe more effectively captures her vocal chops, as this R&B feel does allow her to deliver a little bit more sass. However, Sabrina's lyrical style really just does not match this style so much, as it leaves me feeling a little bit flat, as I would have appreciated more wordplay, more interesting metaphors, and really just more fire under the lyricism aspects of this song. I feel like the overall production is leaving room for that, but we're not getting it out of her, as we kind of get more sass in the delivery and more of a punch in the way she is delivering her words, but we're not really getting any actual word content to really echo this. As on songs she like Please, 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 she's very direct and almost conversational in the way she talks, and here she kind of continues this, and it doesn't really match with her diction or her word choice here. Because overall, this song is more exaggeratory by design in the instrumentation, and I feel like we could have gotten more of that almost sass to the point of almost melodrama. I feel like would have worked here, as Sabrina doesn't really lean into the jagged edges of this song that are presented in the instrumental, which I did not really find myself liking, as that was kind of a clash for me. And sure, it's a nice switch up on this point in the album, but left me wanting a lot more. Similarly, Sharpest Tool continues to bring more of the same style as Good Graces, but doesn't really expand on it as it continues. As far as lyrics, subject matter, instrumentals, and sonic value overall, there isn't much of a change. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but when you're continuing on with midness, you're not really getting much. Overall, this kind of serves as a consequence, as quite honestly, if you played both of these songs, I would not be able to tell you which is which, or even if they were different songs, as they just blend together far too much into what I feel like is a bit of filler. However, on the next track, Coincidence, Sabrina does pick up quite a bit, and she varies a bit more emotionally to create that more effective sass that we know her for. And as she cooks this up, I give this song a 7, as there's more interesting melodies, more interesting hooks, and she makes this song really stand out, and kind of goes away from the R&B drum machine sort of feel that we've gotten before. And I feel like with this more familiar style, she's able to elevate her creativity a little bit better. And when you combine it with the more effective stinginess of her earlier tracks, you do get an interesting song here. It's not quite as memorable or repeatable as other tracks on this album, but it is really something, and certainly comes together as a decent song on this record. Continuing on, as we get more into the middle sections of this album, we find Chem, which I gave a 6. Sabrina had a good opportunity here to show some of those vocal chops we know her for, and is kind of trying to adapt that style a little bit better. And she does it more effectively here. Her vocals are certainly impressive, and I also like the chord progression generally, although I feel like the instrumentation could have used a little bit more in the high end of the frequencies, especially when she drops out, because I understand that her high register is filling up the high end quite well, but when she drops out, I feel like we could have used some sort of softer, higher synth in there to just really fill out the melody and not make it feel like a midsy, bassy, lackluster mix when she's not singing. I feel like we just could have used those flourishes to really add on another level to the song. So while it's left a little bit empty, a little bit barren at times, I feel like it comes together to be a decent track, and is a step on the right direction in this album. As we get into the second half of the album, we find Espresso, which is the other main single on this track, and I really see why this one was the main single, as I gave it an 8. As it just comes accompanied with a very funky bass line, tight production, really well executed lyrics, and a catchy melody on both the verse and the chorus, which is hard to do. Typically you have to pick one, but Sabrina has cooked up a nice melody on all the sections of this song. Sure, it doesn't have the quite same levels of emotion as Please, 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 but I don't really think it needs it as much, as this is a song that exists to be fun, and it executes that quite well, as it really brings that summer feel to its head in this track. Track 8, Dumb and Poetic, I have very mixed feelings on this one, as I enjoyed the concept of it quite a bit, And it's a nice slowdown to show another side of Sabrina, as she demonstrates sorrow rather than sass, which we have become familiar with on this album. But the problem is, it's just so short. You don't even get 2.5 minutes of content on this track, which is really disappointing, as I feel like this song is really building to something, and then you just don't get it, and you're left feeling very empty and flat at the end of this song. I feel like this would have been the perfect time to explode into a bridge and another chorus, but it just doesn't. The song just kind of ends right at its peak. And I feel like for a song such as this, where you are going for that very rigid pop structure, you don't really hit the beats that I think you should when you end the song so early. To be frank, this song just feels incomplete, as I feel like it would work nice as a demo, but not really as a full published song. Because of that, it's just quite disappointing, and honestly I gave it a 4. It's also just very oddly placed in this album, as right after the high of Espresso, where you have this very high energy punch, I don't feel like a drop-off in energy is really warranted here, as this is a track that could go, honestly, a little bit later in the track list. I feel like we need kind of a wind down after Espresso, and we don't get this, as it's just this really oddly placed sad song. Any momentum that was built up from the first half of this album is just really lost here. And it's not in the sense of like this is a distinct second half of the album, as we kind of get back to the same style later in the album. So it's very much not a dividing point to call Espresso the first act of a 2-act show, as we just kind of get a odd down period heading into the rest of the album, which is the same as the first half of the album, if you get what I'm trying to say here. But speaking of twist, moving into track 9, we get Slim Pickins, which, in my opinion, was a very unexpected twist that kind of came as an enjoyable surprise to me, as bringing an old-fashioned sort of twang to this album with an army of acoustic guitars and maybe even a mandolin in there somewhere. This track quite honestly floored me due to the well-produced instrumental and some truly fascinating chord switch-ups and some flares for some dramaticness in the chords, bringing that sort of just fun vibe to this album. Hence why I gave it that 9. As Sabrina brings a softer but still very strong delivery, as we all know she can from her previous singing projects. And this track has just about everything. My one complaint is I thought the mix could have been better, as the army of guitars just kind of gets a bit overwhelming at times, and I feel like maybe you could have either toned down some of the instrumental parts, or, in my opinion, delete one thing from the mix, as I feel like it's just a bit of an overwhelming sort of vibe, especially with the synths in the background, which feel a bit out of place for a track that is trying to evoke sort of a twang. Leading into the next track, Juno, we kind of get back on the same boat we were at the beginning of this album. And here, while the instrumentals are good, featuring a nice, albeit done before, sort of hook, this track drives pretty alright, but is missing a lot of key elements. As my reasoning for this being a 4 is that lyrically it's just not that engaging. And other than that hook, song structure-wise, it is also quite boring. There's honestly just not much to see here, as it really fails to stand out, and I honestly compared this in my notes to the musical equivalent of South Dakota, as I have nothing against South Dakota, like I have nothing against the song, but if I was driving through either, I would not really look out the window much. We'll put it that way and move on to track 11, which was Lie to Girls. Unfortunately, this track did not quite catch me very well. This is really the only track on this album that I just outright disliked, as I gave it a 2, because it just doesn't really have anything going for it, to be quite honest. It just feels like it was recorded in about a day, as the lyrics are incredibly basic and vague, and the guitar pattern is just very basic, very just boring strumming, stuff we've heard before. The synth patches are uninspired, and it just feels like it was whipped up really quick as some filler to throw on here last minute. The instrumentals lack really any sense of dynamics, being very stale very fast, as not much changes throughout this song, and it really fails to bring anything of note to the table. It's mostly just a lot of nothing, and it just left me feeling honestly a little bit bored, and being bored is the last thing you want. But to close out the album, we have Don't Smile, where we kind of hit the problem on the head that has been plaguing this album in the background for the duration, which is just the general lack of inspiration, the lack of boundary pushing, which we have kind of seen a bit and piece of throughout this album. I'm feeling a 5 on this track. It's just another instrumental that does not inspire, being this kind of vague army of pads and a cheap drum machine to accompany it. And of course, the obligatory pop snare sound, which has been seen on far too many pop albums as of right now, and we need to see a variation of snare sounds in pop music, and that's a hill I'll die on. It's a weird hill to die on, but I'll die on it. Sabrina also isn't really giving a chance here to let her vocal chops shine, which I feel like we could have used. We've seen it in other places on this album, and we just flat out don't see it here. Because we know Sabrina has great vocal chops, but I feel like on the conclusion to this album, we would have liked to see everything that she has in her toolkit laid out before us, which we don't. We get a very limited view of what she could do on the last track, which I feel like this track could have been rearranged earlier in the album as we see something a little bit more exciting, a little bit more flary, a little bit more wide in diversity of styles as a finisher to this album. So overall, it's just a rather disappointing track. Not bad, again, but just lacking that oomph that we like to see in the final push of an album. And yes, like always, nicely instrumented, but left a lot to be desired. So, that's all of them. As we conclude, I must say that I think Sabrina simply chose the wrong producers. While it's easy to blame Jack Antonoff for everything because it's funny, I must say he's not fully to blame here. It's the team of producers we have, as Jack Antonoff himself only worked on, I think, 3 or 4 songs on this album. But if you look at the track history of the other producers she hired, yes, they're big names in pop music, but also, do they push the boundaries of their artists? No. Their job is to come in and make money, and that's kind of what they do, as they just put out very mediocre, forgettable pop albums. Because, yes, very few things about this album are bad. There's almost nothing that is bad about this album, besides a couple very important notes that I made in the back half of the album. You can go back and watch them again if you feel so inclined. Because honestly, the main problem here is that it just feels like Sabrina is chasing her contemporary success rather than trying to forge her own. There are hints of tons of pop stars in this album. There are obvious hints of Chapel, of Olivia, of Taylor, a little bit, not so much Taylor, mostly Chapel, Olivia, Ariana. We're seeing hints of pop stars that have done the same thing as her before better. Because it's unfortunate to see a track list of such abundant mediocrity after that incredible arsenal of singles that she put out earlier. Please, 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 and Espresso were so good. That is what I want to see out of a mainstream pop song. And yet the rest of this album, besides those singles and Slim Pickins, is just kind of Sabrina chasing other artists' styles and not really expanding on those incredible singles we saw. Because I think if Sabrina goes in a different direction on this album and follows the funky bass lines, the tight production, the smooth vocal harmonies that we see on those other songs, we would have a great pop album here, ranging in the 8s. But what we're left on is an album where I am most often just sitting here thinking, isn't that Chapel? Isn't that Olivia? Which is unfortunate because I know that Sabrina is a very strong songwriter, a very strong pop artist, and a very strong vocalist who I just think needs to chase her own path and the creative flashes that we see in her work. Ultimately, I don't think it's her fault that she's not really standing out here. I think it's the producers, because we've seen that these producers have a very, very, very diligent style that they follow because they know how to make mainstream pop and they know how to make other artists in the same vein succeed, and if that artist tries to push their personal preferences in a little bit of a different direction than what the producers want, away from the mainstream pop album, they shut it down pretty quick. To be quite honest, I think she needs a producer in the booth who is more likely to push her in new directions. Someone like Unique Tanzil, I think I said that right, maybe, who has most recently been notable for making a very interesting video with Leve on the styles of production that they pursue. I think she needs someone like that, like a Leve, like a Rick Rubin, someone in the booth who is going to push her in new directions and really separate her from her contemporaries, like I know she can. We just need a more diverse group of people in that booth than simply Jack Antonoff and Ian Kirkhope, who just make the same thing on every album. So ultimately, this album does fall into that trap I discussed, which is great singles, rest of album is mediocre. And it's quite honestly disappointing because I know Sabrina can make a lot more. She just needs someone in the booth telling her how to expand her horizons more efficiently and get her going on her own creative, unique forged path. So until she gets that new producer, I'm only feeling a middle 5 out of 10 on this album, and I hope that in the future she can find new partners, new songwriters to help her on her way as she makes more music in the future. Jack Antonoff is still the king of mid. I had to say it, I'm sorry. When I see a Jack Antonoff joke, I cannot resist but make fun of him. You know me. Anyways, Whether you agree with me or not, thanks for watching this video. If you guys want to vote on which album I review next week, make sure to go to my Instagram where you can vote every single week on what album I review. If you want to catch the next video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Please do that, and I will see you in the next one. Sabrina Carpenter, goodbye.